All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union. We might also call this the end of the Cold War. Now, this, depending on how you look at this either started in 1989 or in 1991. But we can pretty much trace the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union to Stalin's death. In 1953, Stalin dies. And it takes a few years to get a clear successor, but in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev is made the leader of the Soviet Union. And he begins a process of de-Stalinization. And before we talk about what de-Stalinization is, it's basically an acknowledgement that Stalinism was wrong. And in practice, what this policy of de-Stalinization did was it allowed for a little bit of freedom of speech. And it really dialed back the Stalinist terror, the arrests, and the forced labor. So it was still there to a small degree, but it had very much slowed down. However, after a series of mistakes, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost resulted in nuclear war, and a number of agricultural disasters leading to famine, Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964. And I think one of the long-lasting effects of Khrushchev was the fact that he was not arrested and he was not executed. He was simply allowed to retire, and he lived in a Moscow apartment for the rest of his life. So he wasn't overthrown. He basically was just set out to retire. And he's replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev basically wanted to recreate the Stalinist system but without the terror and the political violence. And Stalinism just doesn't work without that. So during Brezhnev's time in power, which was a long time, he was in power until 1981. The Soviet Union just kind of limped along. He's trying to run this system without the thing that makes the system go. It's like driving a car without any gas. Like, it might move a little bit, but it's not going to do what you want it to do. So this changes in 1984. So in 1984, we get a young man who takes power after Brezhnev. So when Brezhnev dies, two really old, sick guys replace him, and they last about a year each. And then in 1984, we get a young man, and I'll put young in quotation marks because he wasn't really that young. He was in his 50s. A young man replaces Brezhnev. And his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev, like Khrushchev, wanted to fix the system. And so he puts in place two policies that were designed to fix the Soviet system. And they're kind of modeled on what Khrushchev did. So the first one of these policies is called perestroika. And the second one is called Glasnost. Perestroika is an economic policy. The Soviet Union was centrally planned. So the economy of the Soviet Union was planned out from the center. Perestroika decentralized it. Allowing regions and cities and even individual factories to make economic decisions. The other one of these policies is called Glasnost. Glasnost basically allows for a little freedom of speech and criticism of the government. Gorbachev's argument here is we can't know what there is to fix unless the people out in the system tell us what's wrong. So we have to allow a little bit of criticism in order to know what to fix. And we need to have a little bit of freedom of speech to allow people the freedom to tell us what's wrong. Now, Gorbachev intended these policies to be small. But they were used extensively, and maybe more than Gorbachev intended. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the internal and external causes that toppled the Soviet Union. So we'll start with some of the internal causes. These are things that are happening inside the Soviet Union. And you might consider these two policies to be internal causes. But here are some additional internal causes. One is the nuclear arms race with the United States. The reason there was no nuclear war during the Cold War was a policy or an idea called mutually assured destruction. Basically, what this means is that if you launch nuclear weapons, we'll launch our nuclear weapons and destroy the whole world. So unless you're willing to do that, you don't launch your nuclear weapons. And this was based on an idea that both sides have the same amount of weapons. However, in the 1980s, the United States radically increased their production of nuclear weapons. And the Soviets matched them. Now, they didn't have to. Both sides had more than enough weapons to destroy the planet dozens of times over. But the Soviet Union matched the American production of nuclear weapons. And doing this cost a lot of money. Money that they didn't necessarily have to spend on nuclear weapons. Another internal cause was the Chernobyl disaster. So this happens in 1985. It wasn't so much the meltdown. So this was a meltdown of a nuclear power plant in Ukraine. That wasn't the disaster. Nuclear power plants are kind of inherently dangerous that way, and there are examples of accidents in the United States, in Japan. So it's not, that wasn't the disaster itself. It was bad, but these things do happen. The problem was that the Soviet Union tried to cover it up. When the whole world knew it had happened. there was a radioactive cloud sitting over Central Europe, and everybody knew that it was there, but the Soviets kept denying that it was there. And it took more than a week for the Soviet Union to acknowledge it. And again, when we connect this idea to ideas of perestroika and glasnost, people are now more willing to vent their frustrations with the government. Now, there were some external causes too. These were things that happened outside the Soviet Union. So one of these external causes we see were nationalist movements in Eastern Europe. So not in the Soviet Union, but in the communist countries of Eastern Europe that were aligned with the Soviet Union. So the freedom of speech awakened the nationalism in Eastern Europe. Basically, they wanted to oppose Soviet domination. And they had been beaten down until their nationalism went away. And then this freedom of speech allowed their nationalism to bubble back up. And we see this across Eastern Europe, but maybe the best example of this happens in Poland. Now, there are a couple of unique things that happened in Poland. First, in 1981, we see the first independent, and when I say independent, I mean not associated, with the Communist Party of Poland. Labor union. So we see the first independent labor union. It's called Solidarity. And this was a way for Polish people to speak freely outside of the communist system. And it was too big for the communists to destroy. So they had to allow it to exist. The second unique thing about Poland was the new Pope. And I know it's been a while since we've talked about the Pope, but this Pope is important. This Pope, John Paul II. So John Paul II was Polish, and he hated communism. And so he used his position to attack communism. So he used his position as Pope to get over 1 billion Catholics around the world to listen to him and oppose communism. The last one of these external causes we'll talk about is the war in Afghanistan. So this is not the current war in Afghanistan. This war took place between 1979 and 1989. And this is like a mirror version of the war in Vietnam. So this is the Soviet version of the Vietnam War. And the similarities are very striking. So the Soviets help an allied country, in this case Afghanistan, which was communist at the time, against, so they're helping a communist country against an insurgency. This was an Islamic insurgency that was funded by the United States. So just like the war in Vietnam, the Soviets are helping an allied country, in this case Afghanistan. The Americans were doing the same thing in Vietnam. They were helping an allied country, in that case South Vietnam, against an insurgency. In the case of Vietnam, it was a communist insurgency funded and supplied by the Soviets and the Chinese. This time, it's an Islamic insurgency funded by the US. Basically the same thing, just reversed. It was also very unpopular at home. It's hard to lie about victories in a war when regular people are losing their loved ones and their friends and their neighbors to this war. It also cost a lot of money. And the Soviet Union kind of lost, and they went home more or less empty-handed. Again, very similar to the American war in Vietnam. Very unpopular at home, it cost a lot of money, and the Americans kind of lost it too. And one more thing that we should probably note is that this Islamic insurgency would later go on to become Al-Qaeda, who would be responsible for the September 11th attacks. So these guys hated the Soviets and the Americans. And so once the Soviets were out of their hair, they could turn their attention to the United States. Now, all of these things kind of come together in August of 1991. There was a coup attempt against Gorbachev. That was stopped by his rival, Boris Yeltsin, who would later go on to become the president of Russia after the Soviet Union collapses. While Gorbachev was not overthrown, it became very apparent that the Soviet Union was not going to work any longer. So on Christmas night, 1991, Gorbachev resigned and dissolved the Soviet Union. and created in its wake 15 new countries, some of which have never been independent, and some of them didn't even want to become independent. They were just kicked out of the Soviet Union and told good luck. So this pretty much ends the Cold War, and what we'll talk about in our last video is the globalized world. Now that the Soviet Union is gone, what does the world look like as it starts to become more and more and more interconnected? So we'll do that in our next video, and until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.